Hi everyone and welcome back to Brickcats. If you can leave a like or subscribe, I greatly appreciate your support as always. Today I'm going to give you an in-depth look at the B-Wing model designed by Inthert and available on BrickVault. Like my X-Wing review, I'm going to group this into three major parts. First will be aesthetics, how the model looks. Second will be instructions and parts, where I talk about any problems I have with the instructions or any part substitutions you might want to consider for cost or appearance purposes. After that, there'll be a section on the build experience and structural integrity of the model. And lastly, as you'd expect, a conclusion and recommendation. And that's four parts, not three, but let's get started. If you're watching this video, I assume you've already watched the brick vault video, you've bought the instructions, or you're potentially interested in buying them. And I'll cut to the chase. If you have the money and the patience to collect the parts, this is an amazing model. You will not regret putting this together, and you will not want to take it apart. As you can see, the model looks amazing. It is just so impressive sitting on the shelf. I built all of the Rebel fighters available from Brickfold, and I think this one's the most impressive, not only because it looks amazing, but it's just so different than the other ones. The X, A, and Y wings are, more horizontally oriented, and this one sits on its stand vertically, and it just really has a different physical presence than the others. The vertical orientation is a lot less common in Star Wars, I think, and it kind of reminds you of the UCS Slave 1 and how it sits on its stand. And one nice thing about the orientation and how it sits on the stand is that if you actually want to put this on a desk, it doesn't really take up a whole lot of area. The downside, of course, is that you do need a lot of vertical clearance, so keep that in mind. Also, I'll get to this in more detail a little bit later, but you can't use the UCS B-Wing stand for this model. Now for some of the highlights. The babble damage is by far my favorite feature on this model. It's also really fun to build in. And even though the ship has the bright orange circles, the green and gold vent tiles are pretty unusual colors for Star Wars models, and they really pop out at you in a good way. I also really like how the instructions specify to put this cabinet door at an angle, kind of like it's been partially blasted off. And it's really cool how the interior of the blast marking, if you will, is black, and it steadily gets lighter as you move towards the outside. There's also two other smaller areas of what appear to be score markings. And I know I'm going to spend like a full minute talking about this one little area, but I just think this is so cool because, they say that Star Wars kind of pioneered the idea of a lived in or dirty universe. And this kind of world building with all the other kind of small off color areas, which I'll get into in a second, this thing looks like it just returned from Battle of Endor or something like that, or that the rebels haven't had time to repair this blast marking. So it kind of offers like a temporal aspect in addition to a physical aspect that you don't really see a whole lot in Lego. The B-Wing was designed to be a heavily armed starfighter-sized package that could take down capital ships, and Inthert does a really good job with the weapons on the starfighter. The lower weapons pod actually looks like a pod, which is pretty cool. And then as you move up to the wings, you have the ion cannon and what is a small low-powered laser cannon. And then just on the end of the cockpit assembly, you have two small blasters. There's also a representation of what I believe are the proton torpedo tubes. There are two sets on this model actually. One is in the lower weapons pod, and the other is just underneath those wedge pieces in between the deflector shield pods. The technique for building the orange circles on both the wings and in the fuselage is really clever. And it's one of those things that when you do it, you think to yourself, why didn't I do this before? These orange circles did lead to a pretty significant parts issue that I'll mention later, but they look great, and it's even better they're not studded onto the surface of the fuselage. And last but not least, here's a couple pictures of the simple cockpit. There's a control panel and kind of a heads-up display, no control stick, and a pretty nice brick-built seat. The minifigure does fit in here pretty well, And I would say the cockpit is pretty standard. There's not really anything special about it other than the whole assembly that surrounds it, but it's functional. Now let's talk about the parts and the instructions. Unfortunately, when I bought the B-Wing instructions as part of the Rebel Fighter Pack from Brickvault, I discovered in the course of building the model that the parts list was missing a 1x10 light bluish gray plate, part number 4477. I emailed Brickvault about it and they fully resolved the situation. Just be aware that I'm not sure if they've added back the part, but if you buy the instructions, you're going to want to make sure that there is now a 1x10 light bluish gray plate included in the XML file, or just check your wanted list after you do the export. The only real problem I experienced with the instruction was this step and the two after it. As you can see, this connection is not possible. And by the time you get to this step, you kind of expect the unexpected. So I agonized over this for at least half an hour when I first got into it, and it seriously made me question my sanity for a while. Why can't I make sense of this? What is so obvious that I'm missing here? So what I ended up doing was making an Instagram post and I tagged Inthert, hoping that he would actually deign to respond. And it turns out he did, and it was really awesome because he solved my problem in like 5 minutes. This step is incorrect. You have to stud in the 2x2 corner, and then you use inverted slopes to make the shape. The parts list does contain all the pieces you need, so it's just a matter of getting to this step and realizing that it's wrong, but you have to stud in the corner and use the inverted slopes. There were also a few spots in the instructions where it wasn't exactly clear how you connect other parts because the graphic was oriented the wrong way. Usually with a little thought and some playing around, you can figure it out, and it's not something that makes you throw up your hands and give up. Color-wise, you're primarily using light bluish gray and dark bluish gray, and for the most part, you can't really substitute those, especially the dark bluish gray, if you want to maintain the color highlighting around the engines, the flare at the bottom near the lower weapons pod, and the little stripes on the end of the wings. The off-color elements, such as the dark tans and the various blues, can basically be any earthy color. I wish Bricklink allowed you to specify a range of colors and have the algorithm choose the cheapest combination, or maybe this does exist and I just don't know how to do it. The only piece I had real difficulty finding for an acceptable price was the reddish-brown hinge plate, and I ended up just substituting a white one that I have on hand. To make the orange circles on the fuselage and in the wings, you use 2x4 orange tiles, and those fit inside the brick arch 1x6x2 thin top without reinforced underside. That's part number 12939. You should make sure you confirm with your bricklink seller that you need the part without the reinforced underside, otherwise the tiles aren't going to fit right. My seller apparently had them all mixed up in the same bin and didn't realize they were different. They look pretty similar, but they are slightly different shapes, as you can see from the picture. And therefore, I received 8 arches without the reinforced underside, or sorry, with the reinforced underside, part 3307. And I had to cut out the reinforcement part. And like I said, that's still not ideal, and my parts don't exactly fit right because the arches are different shapes. I also had trouble finding the light bluish gray slope 75 2x2x3 part 3684 in the quantity I needed, so I substituted the slope 75 2x1x3 part 4460B in double the quantity. These slopes make up the spine of the model. Technic pin connector round 2L without slot, part 75535, used in the wing cannons, was or seems to be uncommon in dark bluish gray. I substituted the Technic pin connector round 2L with the slot, part number 62462, in light bluish gray, but any gray would have worked here. The wheel spoked 2x2 with pinhole, part number 30155, is also very expensive in light bluish gray, so you can substitute light gray or even dark gray or dark bluish gray, and those will be fine. They're also much cheaper. Those go under the engine assembly. Finally, in general, For most of the fuselage, if you've already got some of the old light gray pieces, those work pretty well, and they kind of add to the mottled look of most of the Rebel fighters. One thing about this model that I do wish was a little different, and again, keep in mind this is not a complaint, and I totally understand the design constraints that Inthert was dealing with here. The UCSB wing uses part 10312PB03, and that's a custom piece as far as I can tell, and it's really expensive right now. And to be honest, it's probably always going to be very expensive. The windscreen piece for the Jedi Interceptor models is 10312PB01, and it's the same shape and it's a lot cheaper. The look is slightly different, but as far as screen accuracy goes, I think that either of those would be closer than the 30384 piece that the model specifies. But this would make the cockpit more similar to the UCSB wing, and I can't really say that that looks great. So basically, I'm saying I want to have my cake and eat it too. And the fact that I'm mentioning this, I mean, this model looks so good that this is pretty much the only thing I can nitpick. Putting this model together is challenging. With just over 1,400 parts, which is actually less than the UCSB wing, I recommend sorting them into various color and element families before you get started. In certain steps, just finding where and how to apply leverage or pressure is half the fun, especially as the lower fuselage section just keeps getting bigger and bigger. The engine assembly also takes a decent amount of force to snap the sections together. I recommend getting something like a small book to rest the fuselage on, otherwise the torque on the lower weapons pod will cause it to keep popping off. And I actually ended up building the entire thing with the pod off and added it at the end. In my Instagram post, I mentioned how quickly you get to some really cool connections, and I'll repeat that here. Inthert simply did a really good job at making what could easily be a boring build just really fun. When you look at the B-Wing's shape, while it's unusual, it doesn't seem particularly challenging. The beauty of Inthert's model is that the detail is layered in, and there's enough variation to keep you guessing until a whole subassembly snaps together in a way you don't expect. Structurally, this model is definitely one you want to handle carefully. Certain components, like the lower weapons pod, are really fragile if they get tapped the wrong way, and I actually ended up gluing mine because while it held, I simply got tired of putting it back on. The wings themselves have a support strut beneath them, but it's only a 2x1 G-slope, and if you apply too much pressure on the wings, either the G-slope will break off, or the wings will buckle at the joint and break apart. The cockpit mechanism does rotate, but it's not very smooth, and the assembly itself is fairly fragile and tends to break apart in those moments when it does get stuck, especially if you force it. In a display model like this one, this doesn't really matter, but it's something to look out for. The main sections of the engine are solid as a rock, but there are some sections towards the periphery that tend to come loose and break off. The wing cannons aren't as fragile as you might expect. They're connected with two studs, and this actually ties in pretty nicely with Cannon, as the B-Wing weapon systems were intended to be modular, and therefore could be easily swapped out depending on mission requirements or availability. Don't skip the stand. This model is most impressive with the S-foils in attack position. Also, the landing gear, while functional, it doesn't lock in place, so the slightest movement of whatever surface it's on tends to cause them to collapse. For those of you that want to use the ECS B-Wing stand for this model, don't try. I bricklink the parts for that stand just to try it out, and Inthert's model is too heavy, and there's no good spot for each of the angled sections of the arms to rest on. That said, if anyone has a good solution to display this at an angle, please let me know, because that would look amazing. I'm just not sure the model is strong enough to hold up at an angle, and the vertical stand you get the instructions for takes advantage of the most solid part of the model. Here you can see what happens to the landing gear after a little bump. And last but not least, even though it's not really a structural problem, there is kind of an unseemly gap that I can't seem to close with the two wedges underneath the engine assembly. This was also a problem on the UCSB wing. I hope you all enjoyed this in-depth look at Inthert's B-wing model, and as always, I'm interested to hear your experiences. Have you built this model? For those of you that haven't or are on the fence, do you have any questions I didn't cover? I'm definitely interested if you have both this model and the UCSB wing, and how it compares. I've built all of the Brick Vault Rebel fighters, and I think this one is the most impressive. This and the Y-wing are probably my two favorites out of the four. And this one probably has the edge just because the techniques are so unusual and it's just a physically impressive model. Also, if you're not following Inthert on Instagram, you should be. He doesn't only do Star Wars stuff, and everything he does is really clever, and I'm pretty sure at this point he's widely regarded as one of the most skilled builders. Thanks for watching, and I greatly appreciate your time. If you can, leave a like, subscribe, or a comment down below, and I hope to see you back next time.